The opinions you hear on Your Mountain from individual hosts or guests do not necessarily represent those of Your Mountain, our sponsors, or other entities we're affiliated with professionally or otherwise. You've waited long enough. Go listen to the show.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the 200th episode of the Your Mountain podcast.
Ta-da! Cheers,
Ta-da,
Dave.
ta-da, ta-da.
Cheers. Have a
cheers,
drink.
Yeah. Here's my morning Mountain Dew.
Delicious.
Yeah. I'm David Wilms, Nephi Cole. We're here.
Still here.
Still here.
Still here. After
Still
200 episodes. Who would have thought? I wouldn't have.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have thought 200 episodes. I wouldn't have thought I didn't think we'd make it.
You know what? If this was a TV show and there were Nielsen ratings involved and somebody could come in, a producer could
They
come
could
in.
access, yeah. Yeah, but
wouldn't
you
be
can't
here.
do anything. No one could do
can't
anything
that.
about it.
Yeah, if we're willing to pay our monthly subscription for podcast hosting and all that stuff, like they'll just keep pushing it out.
Yeah.
And, so here we are.
Yeah, we're investing in ourselves yet again.
That's right. And investing in this great country.
Yes.
Right.
Or
That's
something
what I like
like
to think
that.
too. Something like that too. Anyway, 200 episodes. And we had talked about having like a really special episode, right?
Yeah.
Like trying to get you were going to deliver.
We did it. We brought a surprise for everyone. We were like, well, what are we going to do for our 200th episode? Well, nothing makes us feel better about ourselves than being right. So for our 200th episode, we decided to just hit it out of the park with like, we told you so. We told you so. This is a good time.
And you joke about it and smile about it, but it's really not a joking or smiling matter.
No, let's have a good time with this. There's, the plane's going down, but you know what they say? You drive it till it hits the ground, Dave.
I'll meet you at the site of the crash.
Fly the plane until it hits the ground. Never quit flying the plane. So for everyone who's listening, we're not on the ground yet, but keep flying the plane.
So here's the deal. We are recording this on Friday, June 13th. And in the late afternoon, while I understand, I don't even remember what was going on. It's like a congressional softball game was going on in D.C. Around that time on Wednesday evening, Senator Lee, as the chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, dropped his bill for purposes of what everybody hears as the big beautiful bill, right? But it's the reconciliation bill. Dropped his piece of items under his jurisdiction for this bill on the Senate side. There's a lot of stuff in it, and I wish we had time to talk about a lot of the other stuff in it, because there's a ton of stuff in here that probably people should care about. Things like Ambler Road being stuck back in Alaska, but the oxygen's going to be sucked out of the room by a provision we want to talk about today, which is the provision that mandates, that requires, that makes it mandatory for the federal government to sell at the low end 2 million and at the high end roughly 3 million acres of BLM, that is Bureau of Land Management lands and Forest Service lands in 11 western states.
I think it's important to talk about a few things about these lands. So first of all, these aren't lands that... So we talked about this, everyone will remember, when we talked about the House side. And everybody was really excited when the provision related to federal land sales died over in the House. With that, remember we were all talking about how many acres, and we were talking about the maps and those types of things. And, two things. First, we said, don't think that this is over. And so when that happened, we said very specifically, This is going to the other side of the house. There will be moves. Something's going to happen. So don't, burn up all your confetti right now and by thinking this is done. Man, this is one of those situations where I actually don't want, it'd be nice if we weren't, saying right. It doesn't matter who's right or wrong, but like this is predictable.
We actually started predicting this about a year ago.
Yeah, and before we get to that discussion, though, I want to note this isn't the same thing that anybody's ever seen before. This isn't the same.
No.
So if you're thinking that this is the same provision that was brought up, I understand where and how. It isn't. This is a totally new ball game. This is Mike Lee's take on the the omelet, and so. We're getting stuff that we haven't ever seen before. And, when you mentioned that we predicted this before, we predicted this when we were talking about the Utah lawsuit.
That's right.
So Utah was seeking audience before the Supreme Court to carry out a case saying, for why they should be allowed to purchase only certain lands that they wanted. And we looked at that, and if everyone remembers, we reminded everyone, we said, you know what? This doesn't seem like it has a whole lot of legal legs. What this feels like is leverage. This feels like somebody's setting something up for congressional action, and this is pushing for leverage or, making a point in preparation for that. Lee, as everyone knows, is an attorney who, I don't know if he wanted to be on the Supreme Court a whole ton, but was discussed as a potential Trump Supreme Court nominee. So this is an individual like Mike Lee who really watches the things that go on with the Supreme Court and the legal arguments. And so it's fair to say that he was aware of everything that was going on with that Utah lawsuit. And now the biggest thing I want to know is does Mike Lee play softball?
I don't think so.
Because it just seems,
or at least he skipped that game because he used that opportunity while people were out, while Congress was out playing softball.
That doesn't seem right.
And
that seems
to
like
throw a fastball like this, or a curveball.
I like that.
Maybe a curveball.
Yeah.
He took that time to throw it. So he throws a nice. He
plays fast pitch. We'll say that about Mike Lee. He plays some fast pitch. He doesn't lob it like I lob it. I'm not.
This is not a lob.
No, this is pretty aggressive pitch.
This is a dart. Yeah, so let's talk about it. This thing came out on Wednesday evening, and I got to tell you, I haven't slept much since then. I spent the next several hours going line by line through this proposal and pulling together a document to try and break this down and what does it mean, what could it do, all that stuff. And to your point, this is different than what we've seen before. So a lot of you, if you're listening to this, I'm sure you've seen the headlines already, 2 million to 3 million acres, 11 states. Let's talk about that. The point of this podcast is to get into the weeds. So I want to get into the weeds a little bit and let you all understand exactly what's in here, all the way through this provision, what's in here. So let me start this with, if it works for you, Nephi, I'll spend a few minutes doing a bit of a dive of the pieces that are in here, and then we can start exploring the nuances of those pieces, just so everybody's on the same page. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
All right. So here's the deal.
Don't get in the weeds with the first go, or else I'm going to feel like I have to interrupt you.
Well, interrupt where you need to.
Okay.
I'll try not to dive too deep in the weeds, but we're going to get weedy because that's what we do on this podcast.
Well, then let's just talk about them.
That's what people expect. So here we go. Let's start with this first thing. So it starts with, and this is creative, right? And maybe you'll say it. Think this too. When you see that 2 million to 3 million acres number, that took some math to figure it out because the way it's written in the text is not less than 0.5% and not more than 0.75% of all BLM managed surface lands, and then not less than 0.5% and not less than 0.75% of all National Forest System lands. I'm going to stop right there. Maybe we'll do it this way. We'll go piece by piece and get a little.
I like
weedy.
that.
Okay, so here's how you get this 2 million to 3 million number.
So first take the 11 states, right? Because it's only...
Yeah, no. here's the kicker.
It sounds like it's 11 states.
It sounds like it's 11. The
But
land
it's not.
the land can only be sold in 11 states. But for purposes of the accounting, for determining how many acres are you required to sell, for BLM, you use all the land in the country and then come up with your 0.5% to 0.75% of 1%, which turns out to be roughly between 1.25 million and 1.8 million acres of land, of BLM lands that would have to be sold. And then on the forest system side, it's there's a little bit more nuance to it. So Forest Service lands were created a couple of different ways. Originally they were created through these forest reserves under the Forest Reserve Act, and the forest reserves were created by lands that were already owned by the federal government, so they're carved out of the public domain. Right? Most Western national forests fall into this category. National forest lands fall into this category. A lot of the national forests in the East do not. They might have been acquired later, purchased from private landowners and turned into a national forest. Those acres aren't counted in this overall number of the acres that you have to sell a percentage of, because they weren't created for the public domain. Part of that, I think, is because in Senator Lee's committee of jurisdiction, those eastern forests, because of that, don't fall under the committee's jurisdiction. They fall under a different committee's jurisdiction. So there's some there's a little bit of math there on, okay, what lands, that's some of the nuance in the bill of what lands are we actually talking about. So think mainly Western forests in all the states and BLM lands everywhere. And those Western forest lands, come out to be, you end up getting a total of somewhere between about 800,000 and 1.2 million acres, which is where you get this combined total of BLM and Forest Service of between roughly 2 million and roughly 3 million. I say roughly because there are other little pieces that I think still need to be figured out. Do all of the national grasslands lands in the West, do all of those qualify? Do some of them not? That kind of stuff. But I think it's fair to say that that's the range.
So
I've heard some people talk about that range being limited to only the acreage in the 11 states.
No,
that
but it's
is not true.
So when they're
for figuring out how much
for
you
calculation
have to sell,
purpose, for saying like, hey,
Yep.
we got to sell. So you take this whole bundle and you're going to say this percentage of that bundle. So if the bundle's 1 million versus 100,000, well, that's a lot bigger number when you do the math based on the 1 million at the end of the day. And the number is 1 point something million. It's 1.8 roughly, right? What is it? 1 point
for which one?
For
BLM
and for Forest Service. I mean, they're almost there's
Forest Service a little less than that. Forest Service is like 1.2. BLM is like 1.8 on the high end.
Yeah. And so there are exceptions, and this is interesting. The exceptions are Montana.
Well,
and we'll come back
before
to
you say that, let me just clarify that. So that's the calculation for the aggregate. Like, how do we come up with the total number of
that
acres
has to
that
be
this
sold?
bill has to be, let's say, have to be sold.
Yep.
Now we talk about
where they can
where
be sold.
They can be sold.
So all those are bundled in. So that's important. So all those are bundled in. Even the stuff that you can't sell, that still counts towards what you have to sell.
That's right.
You can't sell any of it, but it counts towards. But you can't sell any of it. But it means you got to sell a larger percentage someplace that you can sell.
That's exactly right.
So here's where you can't sell. So now that we know that, they've got this big pie, and you have to sell a percentage of the big pie. You can't sell. This is interesting. Montana.
Yep, Montana was carved
This
out.
is critical, and it's very
we'll
important for political reasons. National monuments, national recreation areas, wilderness areas, national scenic rivers, national wild and scenic rivers, national trails, national conservation areas, national wildlife refuges, national fish hatcheries, national parks, national preserves, national seashore and lake shores, national historic sites, national memorials, national battlefields, national battlefield park, national battlefield sites, national military parks, and national historical parks. So you can't sell pieces of those things, but remember, those things existing make you sell a higher portion of what's left.
Now, there are additional exemptions on top of what's left. So you carve out all of these congressionally designated areas, and then also exempted from sale are lands where there are legally recognized rights of title, lease, claims, permits, rights of way. Meaning, if there's a mining claim, if there's a grazing permit, if there's a mineral lease, if there's a right of way issued for, a highway or a pipeline or a transmission line, if there's a wind farm that's permitted, a solar farm that's permitted, all those things, all of those acres are also exempt from sale. Okay. Now, there's a ton of grazing out there on public lands. You've now narrowed this pie of hundreds of millions of acres that could be on the menu, to a much smaller number that's on the menu that you get to choose from for those 2 to 3 million acres. The idea behind this, I think, to try and jam this through is to say, look, we're not talking about selling any of the lands you care about. The lands you care about are the ones that are federally designated for something or that have some sort of valid existing right, economic purpose tied to them. We're talking about what's left. We're not, but that forgets that there are other values to those lands as well, potentially. But here's one thing. There was no map. Remember with the House version?
Yeah.
Like we finally got maps of in Utah in the St. George area. Here's what the proposal. Here were the linear features and the polygons of acres that were going to be sold. In Nevada, we had the same. Here were maps of the parcels that were going to be subject to the sale or disposal under that House proposal. There is no map here because there is no map. Because people are out right now scrambling to try and create a map that creates all of these different layers so you can understand what the menu is of lands that could be sold. We don't know.
You're gonna have to do it. Frankly, it's a big exercise throwing all these things down because, as you know, things like leases and easements and finding those things is that's not an easy feat. And so overlaying all these things to figure out where you could and could not sell is problematic, and it raises two things for me. Number one, I would say that Lee doesn't even know, and they might know like one or two spots that they think this works at. But the other thing, I would say maybe nobody knows. Like it's almost like you just throw this on the, on the wall and just see if something sticks, and let's figure it all out later. Which, as you and I talked about yesterday, is nice because then if we can carve out a tiny piece of paradise for us to buy in this giant sale because we don't know what can be sold and where. Boy, that's really convenient.
Like we find one of those parcels that can be sold and put a quick bid on it.
Yeah, we could get a bunch of friends together. Let's do that. We'll get all the Your Mountain listeners. We will have a Your Mountain. It'll be like a national park, only a Your Mountain park. We'll just everybody send in some money. What a sick joke, right, Dave? Literally, what a sick joke. Because that's possible. That's possible all over the place. Not it's possible. And it's not just us that can do this. It's anybody that can do this. And that's the secret. There are no holds barred on who gets to develop their own little national park, just like Your Mountain Park.
Yeah, let's get to that here in just a second. There's one other piece I wanted to talk about on these exemptions, right? So actually, there's two pieces I want to talk about on these exemptions that I think, like if you think like where could this go? Follow it down its logical extension. Where could this go, and what are the potential consequences of this? Just a couple of days before this bill was dropped, the Department of Justice released a memo that it was in response to questions from the White House about whether the president has the authority to rescind a national monument, right? And the legal opinion from the Department of Justice was that, yes, in fact, the president has the authority to rescind or reduce in size, in addition to creating a monument, has the addition to reduce in size or rescind a monument that was designated by a prior president. Right? Why am I bringing this up? Well, there are a number of national monuments that have been created in the past 20 years that have been carved out of Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service lands that continue to be managed by those two agencies. They are national monuments, but the acres are still BLM and Forest Service inventoried acres, just managed as national monuments. So if a rescission were to come in for some of those, which I can tell you, I mean, there's stuff floating around. The memo itself identifies a couple of these monuments in the West. So if the monuments were to be rescinded, then those areas that had been identified and protected as monuments, it's potential that those acres then could be on the menu of acres that could be sold, right? Potential, because we don't know, some of them still have grazing rights on them, but maybe not on all of the acres.
That's
right? Some of them
actually
might
going to
have
be
pockets of mining rights, but not on all the acres. But you could see places that were once national monuments sold under this proposal.
just a question I had, and I didn't find the answer to this, so I'm going to ask you. So when I look at this, I'm trying to think of how many acres I know of public lands that don't have a lease on them of some kind of a grazing lease, some kind of a a mineral lease. And then the next question I have is, does this provide the secretary the authority to ignore that?
So the first question, I don't know the answer to. It's the thing that everybody's trying to figure out right now, which is, where are all these valid and existing rights, and where, trying to create the maps and overlay all this stuff. I'd heard at one point, and this is, it can vary from state to state, but I thought something like 80% of public lands in Wyoming, for example, had a grazing lease on them, but I'm kind of making that number up. It was a really high number, but it's not 100%, right? You also have leases that might be, or allotments that might be vacant, that could still be, that somebody could still come in and have a lease issued on, but right now might be vacant. If it's vacant, there's no valid existing right on it. So that land could potentially be sold, right?
So
if there's a vacant allotment.
Approximately 62% of BLM lands and 49% of U.S. Forest Service lands are available for grazing leasing, and that's about 155 million acres of BLM land and 95 million acres of Forest Service land. However, not all the lands are actively grazed, with 139 million acres of that BLM land. Remember, they have a total of 155 possible, 139 million acres, and 77 million of the 95 million Forest Service acres lands are actively permitted for grazing today.
I mean, those numbers are available, but where those acres are, that is like still being figured out. So what was your second question?
Can the secretary ignore it? So
ignore.
Does the secretary have the discretion to just say, like, well, do they have to say, well, there's a grazing lease here, not eligible, or can they say, well, for certain purposes, we're just going to not worry, we're moving on. There was a grazing lease, but we're going to do it anyway.
No, I think the language is pretty clear that if there's a recognized right, those lands cannot be sold. But say there's a parcel they really want to sell, there's a way to cancel a lease, right? You can go through a lease cancellation process. Of course, that could trigger some judicial review elements and so forth that could delay it. But if there's something you really, really want to sell, you have the government has the power to cancel leases and then make that land available for sale.
So I will note there's an interesting aspect here. So there are a lot of it has to do with multi-use lands, and one of the special things about federal lands is they're multi-use. What does that mean? That means just because you have one use on the land doesn't mean you can't do another thing. In fact, it's expected that you would do multiple things on the land. A grazing lease doesn't preclude recreation. Recreation doesn't preclude grazing. And that's important because we see these fights within the land use community on public lands sometimes or one user group will say like, oh no, I don't want the other user group here. And I just think this is interesting because, frankly, this points out the reason that we need to have coalitions of, for example, hunters and agricultural users, which would be like ranchers. Why? Because guess what isn't recognized as a multi-use? You know what we can't lease for on federal lands? And that's great that we can't. You don't have a hunting lease on federal lands. And so while they're recognizing that this grazing lease is precluding the sale of these lands, the fact that you or I hunt on these lands, they're not recognizing that as a reason not to sell those lands. It's important that we have this, that we have a coalition of people who, and that we recognize the importance of the multi-use nature of public lands. It could end up that ends up being one of the more protective things that we have in this argument, is people not wanting to lose access that aren't recreationalists, that aren't hunters, fishermen, but people who have an economic interest in these lands. And for that reason, they don't want to see them sold. Just an interesting thought for you.
No, I think that's a great point, is this absolutely does not factor in, where people hunt and recreate. And it also doesn't factor in, what if there's an important migration corridor for elk or bighorn sheep or pronghorn or something here? What if one of those exists? It doesn't factor in the habitat value or the importance to having, connected landscapes so that we have great hunting opportunities and that we have robust wildlife populations. That's not factored in at all. Is there an economic interest on the landscape? If there is, it's excluded. It's also as of the date that the act passes. So here's an interesting thing. What if this law passes and then I get a grazing lease a year later? That I better have a contingency plan, right? Because my understanding of this law is it recognizes those valid existing rights that were in place the day the law passes.
Yeah.
So anything that an oil and gas lease that comes that's acquired after the law passes, a mining claim that's made, a new grazing lease that comes online after that, those wouldn't be protected from sale. Those acres, I think that's like an important piece here too, right? Because things that come online after could be lost. Let me move on to the next piece here, which is, okay, how does the land selection work? Where are these lands? If you've seen the talking point that comes out of Senator Lee, you've seen, well, we have an affordable housing crisis in this country. We're short X number of millions of units. We need to address housing, right? So you must think, well, these lands must be like, all of the lands must be like right next to these towns that really need homes.
Either
right?
that, or you think that this is just a talking point that he's using to justify selling federal lands.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what you're when we finish talking about here, hopefully you recognize that it's what Nephi just said. So first of all, how fast does this happen? Well, within 60 days, that's a 6 and a 0, within 60 days, and then every 60 days thereafter, so every 2 months, within 2 months, and then every 2 months after that, the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture have to publish a list of BLM and Forest Service lands that are proposed for disposal. Those lands can be nominated by either the Secretary or, quote, interested parties. I don't know what interested parties are. They say that those can include states and local units of local government, but I don't know if interested parties include tribes, corporations, foreign governments, individuals like you or me, anybody else. Like who is an interested party for purposes of nominating lands for sale? That's not clear in this bill. But interested parties could nominate them. And here's another thing to get to this housing point. First of all, let me mention one thing. Affordable housing is not said in this bill. That's not a term that's used, affordable housing. It might be a talking point. I think as the hunting and angling community, as I'm looking at this, if we're out there talking about it, yes, we have an affordable housing crisis in the country. There's a shortage of affordable homes. Inflation has caused housing prices to drive up. People are older buying their first homes now than they've probably ever been because they just can't afford them. We've got an issue there, right? As you'll hear as we talk through this, that's not what this bill is meant to address. And frankly, it wouldn't address it. But there's the nominations must demonstrate how the proposal would help meet, this is interesting, it would help meet local housing needs. Now, this is the only place affordability is used, including, not limited to, including affordability and supply. Okay, so affordability is different than supply, for sure, right? So you have to look at, is it affordable? Maybe, but you also have to look at, is there a supply issue, some supply and demand? And it doesn't say in affordable housing, it could just be housing general, but also, and here's the kicker, or address associated community needs. What do you think associated community needs are, Nephi?
Well, probably Burger King, because who doesn't need that? Let's see. Yoga studio, that's pretty, if it's Park City, you got to have, let's go through what you need. Burger King's probably out, but a Qdoba, a yoga studio, you got to have a place to cut your hair. So there's that. Let's see, there's a Target. You got to have a Target because where's your wife going to shop while you're skiing? If it's not, Target. So yes, these things.
Or where are you going to shop while she's skiing?
Yeah, I mean, these are all things that are extremely important, which seem to fall under this extremely broad language that nobody has defined. And so I can think of a lot of things.
Yeah, and I'll take it a step farther too. Associated community needs isn't defined. Community isn't defined. Do we mean a municipality or a county? I don't know.
Or the Your Mountain community, because we're a community too.
One thing that came to my mind is the administration is really interested in, and has said so, of using public lands to build data centers all over the place. So would associated community needs just be economic development, like a business park or a data center that could employ local people, or we need another golf course somewhere. Associated community needs is whatever the community decides it needs or wants. This is really, public land sale, under the guise of affordable housing, but really for economic development, for any use for economic development. And I'd also note, not just for cities or municipalities, because community can be broader than that.
Yeah, it is broader than that in the language. And I think that's, I don't know how long that somebody's been working on this, but somebody has been working on this for a while. But the problem is it hasn't been open for public discussion. The way that this was dropped, nobody's been able to poke holes in this. Nobody's been able to discuss it. And whoever was sitting behind their computer working up this language, they didn't talk to me. And I don't know, not that they should, but to the general public is, and that's the point I'm making, is there are a lot of people that probably want to have had a discussion and part of this, and let's say something like a hearing, but they've never had that opportunity, and they're never going to have that opportunity.
There will not be a hearing.
Nobody's going to get to weigh in on this and say, like, what about this? What about that? Here's some thoughts. Here's some data. Here's some counterpoint. That's never happening.
Right. So, now is the time for that to happen quietly by everybody calling their senators and flooding them with information about, here are the problems with this bill. And one of the reasons we're doing this podcast, and I'll say it right now and we'll say it again, is share this podcast with everybody, because I don't think you're going to find deep dives like this on really breaking this bill down in a lot of places. I'm hoping that we're providing something pretty useful here that you can use when you're picking up the phone and calling your senator's office and saying, whoa, like, you're going to jam this through in a week or two without any public input, without vetting this with the public, without addressing the potential consequences of this action, let alone just the fact of selling these lands like at the onset. But when you dive into the bill and start seeing all of these unanswered questions that could lead you down these crazy rabbit holes. Like this bill is not ready for prime time yet. It's in prime time right now. Right, like it could just get slapped onto this great big bill and be jammed through a process, and everybody is forced to take a vote on just the big bill rather than the individual provisions of it. And that's the whole concept here, is like jam this into something that is a high priority that has to get done in a tight time frame, and force a vote on it without actually learning what the language means, does, says, all that sort of stuff. Like that's where we are right now. Continuing on. Oh, what was that?
Well, I mean, I don't know if we're going to come back to talking about the ramifications for the larger bill, but this is part of the concern that I have. Is let's say that you have other priorities in a big bill. You have something that you actually need to pass, like a budget, or critical pieces of legislation that are attached to that and part of that. When in a situation, how many individuals, you jam this into that bill. You risk the bill. And there's a reason that Montana was carved out of this bill, of this proposal. The reason is that Montana's congressional delegation, they absolutely hate this idea. They're one of the few groups that stood up and Zinke with what he did and said, like, absolutely not. This is my San Juan Hill. And so the reason that Montana was carved out, that's an attempt by Lee to keep Zinke and Daines
and Sheehy
on the sidelines. That's an attempt to keep them from, saying anything about this by saying, oh, no, don't worry, I exempted Montana. But what it ignores, that ignores the thing that Montana, the thing that Zinke cares about. It's not just about Montana voters, because he realizes that these sportsmen that come to Montana and the Sportsman's Voice, it's not just people in Montana. And that's what's lost on Lee, this idea that it's just like a pocket of people in Montana. It's not. It's a national issue and of national relevance. And when Zinke did that, he wasn't standing up for just the people of Montana. He was standing up for sportsmen everywhere. He was taking a stand for everybody, regardless of which state they lived in, that use public lands for, who believe that it is their mountain too.
Yeah, because in his mind, in the way he's described it, public lands belong to everybody.
Yeah.
Like they don't belong to just Montanans, they belong to all Americans.
Yeah.
Right? And so,
in essence, think about this. Think about what Lee did in essence here. What he's in essence done is just said, like, oh, I'm going to carve out Montana, so I'm going to leave 1/50th of all the places that I could, that this is negatively going to affect you sportsmen, untouched, because that's just happens to be in Zinke's backyard. But every other state is on the table. And so the counterpoint to that has to be other people saying, like, no, this affects me too. I don't live in Montana, but this affects me too. And I care about it.
No, that's exactly right. And if you visit, hunt, fish, recreate in any of these Western states, or just like the idea of, appreciate the idea of, I could, if I could get there, maybe I'll move there someday. Maybe I want to take a vacation there someday. You want to know that the lands are there, right? And
we can move on, but this is just, this is an aggressive punch.
It's really aggressive, and it's worth noting, like, we should be nervous about this. Like it is not a foregone conclusion that this provision gets pulled.
No, this is real. For we've had a bunch of times before where we've said, like, yeah, but we've questioned whether this passes or not. I'm not telling you how to think. I'm not. But I will tell you that this is, there have been jabs and feints before. This is a right hook. This is real. This is a real, like, this is a, and some, there were a bunch of jabs, and we talked about that on previous podcasts about some of the legal maneuvering and things like that. There are a bunch of things that were done and like little punches thrown to set this up. This is a real punch.
This is a real punch. Remember this too, and then we'll start talking about more of what's in this bill. If this passes the Senate, remember, it's not in the House bill. There's no land sell-off in the House bill. So if this were to pass the Senate, there's still an opportunity to pull it. And you still have Representative Zinke that has said this is his San Juan Hill. He will not vote for public land sales. And the hope is that he has built a House coalition that could pull this. But right now, you don't have a Ryan Zinke on the Senate side that is standing up and saying, over my dead body, like that's saying, I will not vote for this bill if this is in it. You don't have that right now. People thought it might be Daines or Sheehy, but by putting this exclusion in there,
that's an attempt to take them out of the fight.
It's an attempt to take them out of the fight so that they don't stand up, because now they're not standing up for Montanans. It's not a, I have to do this for Montana. This is my red line. It's going to be the red line for Wyoming. For Zinke, it's the red line for America, right? But we don't have somebody right now in the Senate. Hopefully, with everybody listening and everybody continuing to spread the word and call in, somebody will stand up and be that champion. That doesn't exist right now. And so without that kind of a champion, without that kind of leadership coming out of one of these Republican Senate offices, because it's going to have to be a Republican that does it because it's a Republican majority right now. Without a Republican senator stepping up to do that, there is a high risk of this provision staying in this bill. So it has to be viewed as too politically toxic for people. And I don't care if you don't live in one of these 11 states where the lands could be sold. This is also the slippery slope. If this happens here, you bet somebody else is going to propose something in the future to do something similar someplace else. Like gloves are off, all bets are off. Precedent has been set. This kind of stuff could happen, more regularly.
Well, and that's because there's a process, right? There is another process for doing this, and that's can't be lost on everyone. This is the idea that you can't dispose of federal lands isn't true. There is a process for doing it. This just isn't that process, and so that's the danger. If we've decided that we don't care about the precedent of the process because that's no longer important to us, if it's my priority, then somebody else can do the same thing. And that's there are times, in the past there are other instances, other things that were somebody's tried to pass through this exact same process, and other folks have said no, not appropriate. So yeah, it's interesting.
And I want to talk about a little process at the end of this, but let's run through some of the other provisions here really quick so we can get through it. So we talked about the land selection nomination, how there's the interested parties piece and how lands are nominated for sale and who can nominate them and what are associated community needs. One of the talking points that's come out of Senator Lee's office is there's a robust public process in this. Here's the public process. If lands are nominated for sale, the secretary must consult with the governor of the state where the lands are nominated, relevant local governments, and applicable Indian tribes. That's the quote. So I'll just note, interested party is defined as being states and units of local government. So states are able to nominate these. Local governments can nominate these. So once a governor nominates a parcel for sale, the secretary has to consult with that governor about that sale. That's what I'm looking at is there's the consultation. There's maybe a nefarious reason for the consultation here. I don't want to claim it's nefarious. Maybe I shouldn't use that word, but there is a provision in here that gives states the right of first refusal on a sale in local government. So if you or I, Nephi, nominated a parcel for sale in a state, well, then the secretary would have to consult with the governor about that parcel. And the governor could be like, ooh, I'd kind of like that parcel. And so they have the right of first refusal. They can then buy that instead of the individual. And maybe that's okay. It stays in that way. It stays in a more public domain instead of going to the private sector. I don't know.
The way that this law is written makes it the easiest person to purchase is a state.
It is.
The way that the law is set up, it sets up a state so that no matter what all the other stuff going on is, again, the states have right of first refusal, right? And so I mean, basically, somebody else says, "I want to buy this parcel." The state can say, "Not me first," and they can do that. And it has to be. It's interesting. I think we'll probably talk about. We might not, but fair market value. So all this stuff.
Should.
Yeah. So all these sales have to be sold at quote unquote fair market value. Which creates, there's some unique challenges there. So if you're a state and somebody shows up, and they say like, we're going to buy this land and we're nominating this, or this is the part that needs to be disposed of. And the cost is fair market value. What does your state have the money to pay fair market value for those lands? And so in a way, this is quite different from this idea of just giving the federal lands to the states and hoping states don't sell them. Because now you're saying the land must be disposed of and states get first crack. That's not giving the land to the state and worrying about the states having enough money and then getting rid of it. That's saying the state must first buy it for, let's just call it $100,000 an acre. And then, times X number of acres, because that's a lot. And then now the state has to worry about, now does the state have money after it's depleted its coffers to buy the land? Now do you have the money to manage it? So I think, do the math, but if you didn't think that states could afford to manage it before, and I don't know if you did or didn't agree with that, but that adds a new wrinkle to states, because if you couldn't afford to manage it before, or if it was questionable, now you're out a whole bunch of cash and you have to manage it. And so I don't think that there's a high likelihood that states will be the primary purchasers.
Yeah, but it's certainly set up for them to be. But I agree with you. It could be be anybody.
They could purchase it, but here's the thing. The states could purchase it and they could have a redisposal process. They could purchase it and say like, okay, well, we have first right of refusal and we want to be the ones that decide how our state looks. And so we're gonna make the commitment. Our legislature's gonna go into debt. We're gonna buy this land, but don't worry, we are going to have a process to then resell it. And there's no sideboards on that. So if the state, where there are these sideboards about who gets to buy it, and there's no sideboards once it's in that private domain. There aren't sideboards in this bill for then what can happen to it.
There's one sideboard. Right. The one sideboard is that for 10 years, that land has to be used for the purpose that it was identified for in the sale.
So if it was for housing.
Then for the first 10 years, it has to be used for housing.
Yeah, or other priorities that are important to the...
Other community needs or whatever like that. Right. So it's very broad. It's very broad.
What I'm saying is you can absolutely the state can absolutely subdivide it. So if they pick up a big chunk of land, they can absolutely turn it into the whatever size ranchettes they want.
Because that's what they're encouraged to do. That's what this bill encourages, right? That's the idea, is economic development, right? Use these lands for economic development. That's the motive of this bill. But I want to come back to an earlier point I made, or that I talked about, that I put a pin in, said we'd come back to. Remember I said, if you wanted to address housing, you'd probably do it really close to communities. Find those small parcels that are dump sites right now or something, right in or adjacent to a community that's got a housing crunch. There's a prioritization schedule of sorts. Like the secretary gives priority to for disposal of certain lands if they meet these criteria. Okay, adjacent to existing development. Okay, we're on that track. Adjacent to existing development. That makes sense. We want affordable housing, or we want housing adjacent to existing development. Makes sense. Have access to existing infrastructure. Okay, that makes sense too. Maybe a power line there. If you're going to build a home, you don't want to have to run new infrastructure in. Okay. Are suitable for residential housing. Well, that makes sense. Close to a community. Now listen to these. Reduce checkerboard patterns and are isolated or difficult to manage. Isolated parcels aren't, it's hard to call those adjacent to communities or infrastructure. And reducing checkerboard patterns. I'd have to look at the map of the entire West, but I can tell you at least where we live here, Nephi in Wyoming, when you run into the checkerboard, most of that I wouldn't call adjacent to existing communities. In fact, most of that I borderline call uninhabitable. There's a reason why there are not people living there. Very remote, isolated. Anyway.
Now, one of the things if you that are interesting in this is the sale and who gets first dibs on buying, other than the states. So, because these checkerboard lands and the lands that are difficult to get to that are identified in here, it also gives a preference for the person to buy to be the existing bordering landowner.
Yeah. So think about the big landowners. So yeah, let's mention that for a second. So in the sale process in this bill, they're saying we're going to have a sale, and at every sale, nobody can purchase more than 2 parcels that are put up for sale. Maximum of 2 parcels, with an exception for states and local governments and landowners that are adjacent to parcels. So think big landowners that might have in-holdings, or think about landowners in checkerboards. Think about the corner crossing case we've talked about a bunch.
Exactly what I was thinking about, Dave.
Yeah, think about that. That landowner could come in now and say, I want to buy,
all of those lands.
All of those lands, and he's got the pockets deep enough to do it. Right? So goes through this huge battle. He's looking at pushing this to the Supreme Court. He's trying his darndest to keep the public off of public lands. And there are people that want to use this, that want to hunt there. And actually, when they did hunt there, it was great elk habitat, and they got in there and they killed some elk. You know what I don't think are on now there might be some grazing leases in there that may prevent those acres from being sold. So don't say that. I don't want this to be like held up as the example of this will happen. I'm just using it as that's the type of situation where it could happen if the other criteria are met of no grazing leases on those lands.
Well, here's the other thing. Who do you think owns the grazing leases, Dave?
Right. And he could just say, I give up those.
Lease.
He could just cancel the lease and then buy the land.
Yep.
Right. So you could see situations like that where a landowner may say, I'm going to cancel that grazing lease, and now I want to nominate and buy those lands. And the only way that could be stopped, really, suppose you might say, well, maybe there'd be an auction and they'd get outbid. Ha ha ha. There's a solution for that too, because under the method of disposal in this bill, lands may be disposed of by sale, by auction, or, quote, other means at the discretion of the secretary. Other means could be, I walk into your office and say, I want to buy these lands.
Yeah, it's just
here's the fair market value for those. And then the secretary would say, okay, I am required by law to consult with the governor, and I am required to consult with the local community, but I don't have to do a public notice. I'm not required to do a public notice of this sale. I'm not required to notify the public at all. I'm not required to have a public auction or sale. So I can do a quiet backroom deal, and all I have to do is call the governor and say, hey, we're going to do this under the guise of, quote, consultation. And unless the governor comes back and says, you know what, actually, I think I'd rather the state own that land, which in the checkerboard, that's not going to happen. The state doesn't want that complication, right? That landowner is going to be able to buy those parcels.
Well, that's interesting. It's good and bad. I mean, there's some other interesting wrinkles here. So, if you're looking at this from the outside, I think some of the people that I would think would have questions about this are people who have existing, so we're talking about the big landowner, right? And like, well, he's the person that's adjacent and gets to purchase. But what if you're a small landowner? What if you're somebody that's bordering a national forest, and you don't want neighbors? That's an interesting question that I have. There are a lot of people that maybe listen to this, and there are folks that want to. I always say one of the values that exists is if you have a special place that you have access to, you own a little cabin, your little slice of heaven somewhere. Don't sell that because they don't make more of them. There aren't more coming around. What if you do have that little slice of heaven, and you've you've invested a lot of your what if it's your family history and your personal money into having that, and suddenly, like, that's not the case anymore. These public lands that you've built that are part of your equity, that are and this is maybe muddying things, because I know a lot of us who are public land love public lands. But one of the things is that we don't like is this idea of this, the value to an individual of being next to those lands. If you have 1 acre next to the Bighorn National Forest, that acre's worth a whole lot more because you're right next to the Bighorn National Forest. What does it do to the value of those things that you already own if suddenly we're selling everything around it and privatizing it? It's just another interesting wrinkle that doesn't get looked at by this, because we're not going to have a hearing about it. We're not going to discuss it. We're not going to go through that process of figuring out how it affects different, groups and entities with the proposal. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. I do think I need to mention, so there are several times that it says this land. So for example, a tract, there's land here. A tract of covered federal land disposed under this section shall be used solely for the development of housing or to address associated community needs. Again, I go back to that community needs as defined by the secretary concerned. So one of the community needs doesn't necessarily have to be
Housing.
A municipality. It can be community, can be the broader sense of the word community. It could be the county. And one of the community needs theoretically could be, this checkerboard pattern is complicated from a taxation standpoint, from a management standpoint.
I was thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah.
There's a reason PILT, payment in lieu of taxes. Why?
Yeah.
Because when you have too many federal lands in an area, especially if there's a discussion about the value of PILT or paying PILT, basically, it's really hard to pay for your roads and everything else because there's no property tax on those lands. So you can make an argument that it's in the interest of the local. It certainly is in the interest of the community to have somebody paying taxes on those lands versus not receiving a reasonable payment in lieu of taxes.
Yeah. So my point of saying this is don't buy the talking point. Don't believe the talking point that this can only be used for housing. This is really carefully and creatively crafted. Remember, Senator Lee is a smart man. He's not a dummy. Remember, Senator Lee has been on I don't know the short list, but at least a semi-short list for consideration for the United States Supreme Court. He's clerked. He's been a clerk for a United States Supreme Court justice. Those roles don't go to dummies. He knows exactly what he wants, and he's crafting the language in a way to make it happen. It's squishy on purpose, right? It's squishy on purpose because the idea here is this land, if it is sold, it can be used for any associated community needs, can be anything. It can be anything, right? And I just want to drive that point home because it means that you can sell parcels near, you can sell parcels far. It does not have to be used for affordable housing. It does not have to be used for housing. Even though the words say solely for the development of housing, putting that qualifier or to address associated community needs opens this up for everything. Like, it's all on the table. I just have to drive that point home. Now, I think we've talked about most everything, except for there are two things left. One is, where does the money go? if these parcels are sold. A reminder right now, if public lands are sold under a process that's created by the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which go back to a prior podcast, we've talked about this. Here's the 30,000 foot view. There is a process that has been established under federal law passed nearly 50 years ago for disposing of federal lands. There are a certain subset of lands that if you meet certain qualifications, that they could be put on a list that are subject to disposal. And there is a process in FLPMA, Federal Land Policy and Management Act, for how you sell those lands. The size of the parcels matter. If the parcel gets too big, it has to go to Congress. Congress has the ability to disapprove of those sales. There is an explicit process that involves the public at every step of the way. It involves going through a resource management planning process to identify those parcels that might be suitable for disposal. And then once you do that, going through a separate process for how do you actually dispose of those lands. Public has the opportunity to weigh in, provide comment, feedback, reasons why those parcels shouldn't be sold. Then it goes to a public auction. Lands have to be sold at fair market value, but in a very public process that's noticed to the public. All of that stuff is involved. And then when those lands are sold under the Federal Land Transaction Facilitation Act, the proceeds from that sale go right back into the land management agency to be used for being able to acquire access easements or do habitat restoration or acquire new, better lands. The idea is if you sell off the less suitable, desirable lands, you're going to make the state as a whole better, right? This bill works around this in multiple ways. First, where does the money go? Sales, 90% of the money goes right back into the U.S. Treasury. So these land sales are used to try and cover budget gaps created by these tax cuts. Like there's no other way to put that. If you're going to cut taxes, you either have to cut expenses or you have to raise revenue. Right? And so one of the things here is trying to find places to raise revenue, and this is viewed as a way to raise revenue to pay for some tax cuts. Right? That's a one-time shot in the arm. It's not a continuous revenue raiser. Right? It projected to raise, and I don't know if this number is actually accurate, but between $7 and $10 billion if these lands are sold. 90% of that goes to the Treasury to be used for just general government operations. 5% of the sales go to local government that has the jurisdiction over the sold tract, and 5% is set aside for deferred maintenance on the BLM or Forest Service lands in the state where the tract was sold. So you're going to hear the talking point that the land from this goes back into to solving deferred maintenance issues on these public lands. Well, 5% instead of all of it, or 95% or whatever. Like 5% goes back in. Most of it is pulled away. So this is a big work around the existing law. Right? And then the other piece is there is a provision in here that says the secretary selling these lands, the process identified in this bill, that all these sales are deemed to comply with sections 202 and sections 203 of FLPMA, meaning they are deemed to comply with the land use planning provisions, all the public notice provisions, all the public participation requirements, all of the land sale requirements, all of the they
it's just saying we don't
with FLPMA.
It's saying we don't have to do FLPMA.
Bingo.
That's all it's saying. We say it's deemed to comply just means we're not going to do any of that.
Bingo. This is a big push that law aside and we can fast track this. And what do I mean by fast track? The bill also says that all of these land disposals, the 2 to 3 million acres, that they shall be sold within 5 years of the enactment of this bill. 5 years. So remember, they have to start the nomination process, this disposal process, within 2 months of the bill's passage, and they have to be done with selling it all within 5 years. That's the public process. I mean, that's the process. So, public's cut out of this. This land is required to be sold. That's the rundown of this bill.
You know what's
and the
interesting?
final piece, and then we'll talk. Final piece, there's a $5 million appropriation to both BLM and the Forest Service to administer this program. So that's the bill. That's the deep dive digestion of what's in this bill.
I wanna play devil's advocate for a second.
All right.
Okay, so what are some good reasons for what are the arguments for moving forward with disposal of federal land right now when we look at this? And the one I'd like to concentrate on is the economic argument. The argument that we have a resource, we're a country that has debt, right? And we have a resource in land, and we can move land. We can basically turn, we have an asset. We're going to turn that asset into cash money, and then we're going to use it to pay back some of our debts. So, what's the most valuable land? And if we were doing this for cash reasons, if we were making the argument that we're going to do this, here's what we're doing. We're doing this to try and make money. So I guess what I'm saying is these arguments are antithetical to each other. This idea that we're going to build affordable housing, but this is a great boon for the country because what we're going to do is we're going to earn this money. When you talked about like how much money this is going to raise, let's say it raises $10 billion, do the math on 300 million acres and $10 billion and tell me what you sold every acre for. And then ask whether or not you would sell an acre of irreplaceable forest land. Ask me whether you could buy an acre for the Your Mountain commune, if we could get that for $3,000 an acre. And tell me whether that's a good deal for posterity.
Is that the number that you came up with?
Well, I'm just doing it at the back of an envelope, but if you take 3 million acres, what's 10 billion? 1,000 million. Sounds to me like about $3,000 an acre.
Yeah. So that tells you that there's going to be some that's more expensive than that and some that's way less expensive than that. A lot of that checkerboard land is going to be like $500 an acre, $200 an acre, $100 an acre.
Well, and if it's at fair market value, there's the other question. Do you really, it's pretty inexpensive, to be frank. And, it's just, again, some of these arguments they just don't work with each other. And that's just because these, if you and I come up with we come up with some really great ideas, Dave, you and I. But the problem is we're not actually all that smart. And so you need a community of people sometimes to weigh in on your really good ideas and to tell you where the holes are. And to me, the biggest concern about this is that you need a larger group. You need a large, these types of impactful changes deserve, I think, a robust discussion because, and this instance, all these instances are different. You can't say that this thing is exactly like something else that's in the bill because you're talking about something that affects, you're talking about disposal of land that belongs to everybody. And so if the land belongs to everybody, maybe it deserves a little bit of discussion on what the value of that land is. I know from my personal experience what I think the value of public lands are, and it's pretty high. And so the question of this disposal this way, I think it begs, shouldn't we talk about it? And I think that's the, I think more than anything else, I think that's the concern that I think, I think that's valid. Regardless of where you sit on this issue, when you talk to your senators and you talk to your congressmen, this deserves a little bit of discussion. The land belongs to you. The land belongs to me. And so if you're going to sell my place or you're going to give me a neighbor that I, didn't necessarily know that I wanted or didn't want, that's worth talking about.
It is. Also, I think we've made this point before. This reconciliation process, there's a ton of stuff in it. almost all of it, a future Congress could undo. Almost all of it, that, if priorities change, if politics change, somebody could come in and undo it. Like, are there going to be consequences, good and bad, whatever side of the issues you're on, right? Are there going to be consequences to some of these decisions?
You can
Absolutely.
tweak things, you can change things, all those things, because, they're policy changes.
Right. Once you sell land, like, the next Congress can't come in and undo that. The title's been transferred. They're not going to come back and use eminent domain to pull it back.
Yeah,
right?
It's forever.
It's forever. And if something is forever, it warrants a robust public debate, discussion. Like, it doesn't, like, it just, to your point, it just doesn't make sense to squeeze this into a bill that is being fast tracked to meet some arbitrary deadline sent by leadership because they feel like they got to get this done by a date certain, in advance of the next election, right? Before people are in cycle and have the pressures of an election cycle, they got to get this done. Right?
I'm going to
And
pick
so
on
squeeze this stuff in that has no hearing, that has no opportunity for public comment, that has no opportunity to improve language. Like, even if you support selling public lands, I think you said this, even if you support it, shouldn't it be done in a very public, transparent way where you actually have a chance to work through some of the obvious questions in this bill, like in the way the language is drafted? It's just, I mean, obviously, I don't want to speak for you, Nephi. Obviously, I fall in on the side of, I don't want to see mass sell-offs like this of public lands. I'm in the camp of saying we have a process. We've had a process for 50 years, and it's a robust process with a lot of public involvement that takes a little time for a reason, because you can only sell lands once. But that there might be parcels that make sense to sell in places. I'm not a no acre anywhere ever kind of person. But this way, this is like a nuclear bomb of sorts in the terms of selling off lands.
I think it's fascinating to look at two different states and their approach to this and their different mindset on this that are both Republican states or conservative states, Montana and Utah, right? Next door neighbors. Actually, they don't actually touch each other.
They don't border each other.
Yeah.
They're down the street from each other, though.
Yeah. And
I have a good friend
Wyoming,
that lives
only
down the street.
Wyoming, we're the only thing keeping these people from fighting right now is us. So thank us later. But but look at the difference in the way that they're approaching this. Both states have huge amounts of public land, right? And in one state, you have a group of senators who clearly recognize, and the senators are the populists, and I think it's both, who clearly recognize, and maybe in fact this is it. You have a populace in these conservative states who, one, has been very vocal with their elected officials, and their elected officials have recognized, they've recognized the value. They've recognized that part of what makes their state special is these public places. And that's part of why people want to move there. That's the draw. That's the excitement. That's the magic, is these public spaces. Then you have another state where certainly I would think that the average Utahn recognizes that too. That, for all the discussion about how we have these concerns of, we don't like what the federal government and having to, deal with them in management. The reason that people want to move to these special places is because of that open space and the opportunity that those public lands provide. What happens when you do away with that? And I think that one group, one delegation has had that discussion and recognizes the importance, and one just doesn't see it that way yet. And the difference in the two, honestly, is the amount of discussion that's happened in Montana. It's that the public in Montana has spoken, and they've talked about it. And perhaps in other places they haven't. And so if you feel like Montanans obviously feel about this, like Ryan Zinke obviously feels about this, then I think you probably owe it, to yourself to make your voice heard and to talk to somebody and tell them how you feel about it.
Yeah, that's right. Pick up the phone, call flood senators' offices right now with this. They're getting calls on all sorts of stuff. It can be white noise if it doesn't rise above. So they got to hear from just a flood of people on this, that this is, not on my watch, not in my backyard, not this way, right? Like this isn't the way to do business. This is just bad public policy, just the way it's being done, irrespective of the actual proposal, the way it's being done. It's just bad public policy.
Well, happy 200th, Dave.
Happy 200th.
And to all of our listeners, you're welcome. Glad we could give you a spicy episode for episode 200. Something that matters. Wait till you see what we have lined up for 300. It's going to blow your mind.
We're already planning. Thank you, each and every one of you. And thanks for listening. And remember that life is about experiences. So go have one.